guys, Diva here, and to jump into it, we are going to be doing a little bit of reading today. I visited the library recently, and I had a couple holds come off of hold recently, and so I'm going to be chipping away at my, I'm going to call it a physical TBR, but like you guys know, I don't have a TBR. I like to think I have a TBR, but I'm very much like a mood reader, and like when a book catches my eye, I either put it on hold or I get it from the library. And so this is me just kind of like chipping away at reading the physical books that I have. I'm getting more into using my Kindle, which has been nice. Not like necessarily daunting, but there was just something very that felt like, whoa, I've never used this before about it. So I feel like I'm only kind of now getting into really using it. Like I traveled recently and I brought it with me and I read a little bit on that, even though I mostly had it in my suitcase for fear of like losing it or like it breaking or getting like a crap full of sand in it. I'm going to be doing some reading today, and probably over the next couple days you guys can follow me, or maybe this will just be like a day of vlog. I'm reading in the car, which is new, different, fun. The intention was to read outside. I'm at a really pretty lake. The view is gorgeous. I was sitting outside for a bit. This is the first time I've been to this park, and definitely coming back during the summer. The thing about me about reading in the car, I hear people talk about it like all the time, but there's something about just like I don't have enough space. But I brought a lot of stuff to make sure that like I don't feel like the walls are closing in. But here are the things that I brought to read. I took them out of my book lover tote bag already, but like, isn't she cute? Isn't she pretty? I love how kind of just small she is. I feel like it allows me to find everything kind of quickly in my bag, even though I do wish it had like my other tote bags, like a zipper in it to even just put like simple things like my keys. I think the design makes up for it. Snack wise, I have Smart Food popcorn, Go-Go Squeeze. I have a clementine. When I was packing this, I felt like I was like sending myself off to like school, which was funny. I did have matcha. I no longer have matcha. I drank it on the way over here because I visited another park first that I thought I'd be able to sit by the lake, but it was more of like a you had to park on the road type of situation and then you had to like walk into the park. But again, it's a little too windy and a little too cold. So I drove to some other place which is like not too far, but like farther than I've been before to come to a local park. So that's where we are, and I drank it on the way and then I had to use the bathroom, which you guys don't need to know that because we're reading today. But I also have my water, my noise canceling headphones, which I just like to have on my head sometimes to just like block out noise. And then I brought like a pillow. That's not the pillow, but I brought a blanket, and then there's a pillow. The pillow is probably like overkill, but I'm just going to like lean down my seat, and I've already like opened my passenger side window. I know it's sunset, which that's what I'm probably gonna say until to read these books is gonna be really pretty. And so yeah, this is just gonna be us chilling and reading and my thoughts. I also started this vlog because for the life of me, sometimes I'll be reading and I'll be like really in the midst of the book, and then I'll finish the book and I'll be like, I should have shared that with you guys. I put Deep End by Ali Hazelwood on hold before I went on my trip. I also thought I would be like 90 millionth in line to like able to get the physical copy, but it was immediately ready for me like when I came back from my trip. So I picked it up, which I'll also share that my thoughts about that book in this wrap up, even though I didn't read it with you guys because I literally finished it last night. I'm making the journal page. Believe me, I'm not lying. Why would you think I'm lying? I need to start reading. I need to start reading. For the Love of My Afterlife, I've had this book for a while. It was gifted to me through the Berkeley Influencer Program. Yeah, guys, it's me. I use this little like photo strip of me as a bookmark. A couple chapters into it for a book club that I recently joined, and then we're gonna finish it before our next meeting. First impressions is that I like the concept. I think it's interesting. I think it's always funny when I hop into a book and then like realize along the way that they're like British from like verbiage and dialogue. It like comes to you. There's been a lot of back-to-back pop culture references. If you guys know me, you know that I don't unilaterally dislike them, but I think a lot of the ones in here are being utilized for humor, which doesn't really work for me. And I also just think like it's just like not for me. I've tried to like let them like not bother me the more that I feel like they appear in more like contemporary romances that I read, but I understand, of course, when they're being used to like set the time and place and things like that, but like otherwise, and mind you, it is like low key, like every other page, every other paragraph, from like a celebrity to a movie to a reference to like something else. Mind you, I'm only like 7 chapters in, so I'm going to give the book more of like a chance and I'm going to finish it. But I can kind of gauge from like the writing style of a book. Like I may not end up liking a book sometimes, but from the writing style, I'm like, oh, like I'm going to read more of this author's work. Like I enjoyed Between Friends and Lovers, for example. Just think of like a book that I enjoyed like a while ago. The ending left me kind of like, even though I did enjoy the book mostly in its entirety. But I know from the writing style, and I would like to read another book by that author. From this book, there's just something about the humor. Like I can tell when like the humor of a book like isn't clicking for me, and that's what it's leaning towards. But honestly, like since I haven't even reached chapter 10, I don't want to like unilaterally like judge it too quickly. It could wrap up in a way that like makes me possibly want to. So we'll see. I'm gonna start Kindred first since it's been so long since I read it. I feel like the little like nuances and like the twists I don't necessarily remember. Like 16-year-old Diva does not remember that. And so we're gonna hop into this one first. Hey guys, long time no see, which it's been like 2 seconds for you guys probably, and it's, what time is it? It's been about like 2-ish hours, like an hour and a half for me. The park is closing soon, and the parking lot is kind of empty, which is scary. And the sun is setting. I was hoping that I would get to, the sunset is pretty. I was hoping that I would get to see a little prettier of a sunset. I'm probably gonna see it on the way home. I'm ending on page 101. I don't know why, for the life of me, I'm not that kind of reader, why I thought I was going to stop reading Kindred and then read The Love of My Afterlife. Once I get like hooked really into a book, I like to finish it in one sitting. Honestly, if the park wasn't closing and the sun wasn't setting, I would probably stay here and finish it. But I also feel like it's one of those books that I know like for a while it's going to be like sitting with me again. But that's why I picked it up, because I wanted a book to like sit with me. Also, I want to read more like speculative like fiction by Black authors, and so I wanted to pick something. But it feels really poignant to end on the sentence too. I never realized how easily people could be trained to accept slavery, because that feels like kind of a hallmark of the beginning of the end for this book. That feels like such a haunting sentence for the way things have already been happening in the book. This book has already managed to surprise me in a couple of ways, and that's why I wait a long time, and that's why I rarely reread books, because like when they sit with me and they're fresh in my mind, it doesn't make the rereading experience as not necessarily as enjoyable, but so much more like I remember this so clearly, like why would I read it again? But since it's been so long since I read this, and Octavia Butler's work feels like so particularly timely right now, felt like a good time. But yeah, the conversations that Dana, who is the main character, and her white husband Kevin have been having have been, even what she mentioned, I don't want to spoil, but I'll talk about it at the end. I also really like how the chapters are formatted in this book. It's like a section, and then the chapters, as opposed to like the chapters kind of happen one after one another. I don't really know how to explain it, but I like that kind of formatting. I kind of wish that carried over into other books. Really not the biggest deal, but that was nice to see. Yeah, I feel like some bad things to say the least are already happening. I realize I'm somebody who talks to myself while I'm reading, and I don't think the camera captured that, but literally like and like and like talking to myself like, oh my god. It's also incentivized me to watch Kindred, the adaptation that came out. It was already canceled by the time that, and it makes me wonder like if the whole first season follows the book itself, which in that case, like I think when books are adapted and then they get second seasons and those second seasons were not a part of the book, it's like imagined like storytelling that doesn't always work out the best. But it was canceled, so it kind of like de-incentivized me from even like starting it. But I feel like after this book, I feel like this book again is going to sit with me, so I'll have to like wait a little bit, but I do want to watch it, and so that's where I'm going to end off. Yeah, and so let's head home, and I will see you guys later. Hello, friends. It is the next day. I am going into the city for a little bit for brunch to meet up with a friend. And so just while I'm like traveling, I'm going to bring The Love of My Life, the Love of My Afterlife with me just to read it along. Like I wanted to bring the physical copy, but I have it on my Kindle, and so I brought my Kindle, which I'm trying to get more comfortable with having it out in nature. I'm like always prematurely on guard about like everything, but I brought it, I have it, and let's go catch the train. Also, just temperature dip from yesterday. I have my coat. I'm gonna go put on my scarf, which thank God I brought it, because I was like, oh, maybe I should, like maybe I shouldn't. Thank God I brought it. So let's go. And going to brunch at what I think is like this cutesy half like brunch, half like bookstore, which I've never been to before, and I love to explore. Like, I mean, I hear brunch, I hear bookstore, like I'm sold. So let's go. Hey guys, let's talk about my progress while I slug my face. Slugging is like locking in the moisture barrier with usually something like healing ointment, and so I put on my snail mucin and my moisturizer, and so it's time to put on this. I feel like lately my skin has just been like really dried out if I don't apply this, which feels like there's something deeper at play, but you know, sometimes you don't have the mental fortitude to examine it. And right now, my skin is looking pretty decent, but yeah, it's been really dry. If anybody has like combination skin and has like recommendation for moisturizer in particular, I would love to share the beats with me. Let's slug and talk about the love of my afterlife because that's what I have been reading today. I feel like I didn't make that much progress when I was in DC. I got way too distracted when I was at the bookstore, and then I met a friend for brunch, and so we were gabbing and talking and laughing and living life. And then I read a bit on the train, but I'm like chronically scared of like missing my stop. So like every time I got like 1 or 2 stops away, and the ride isn't that long, and so by the time I like got on my stop and then like was preparing to get off at another stop or like transfer, it had already been time to like stop reading, and so I didn't make like I read about like a chapter or two, I feel like, on the way there and the way back, and also like when I was sitting, which was nice. But I feel like I made a real progress now when I came home. I didn't show you guys, but I came home, I relaxed for a little bit. Now I'm putting on my fave lip moisturizer. As you can't see, but it never fails me. It's the Blistex DCT lip moisturizer. From the sink. I've been singing its praises since I started using it. Like, oh my god, you apply it at night and my lips are like so soft. And it doesn't have like, there's another one of this that I've been trying. Maybe you've seen me use it. It's like a cherry lip balm, but that one causes a little bit, I feel like, of like white creasing around the mouth, which I like cannot stand. But this one in particular, I feel like none of that. Maybe it like peels off the dry skin, but like it never fails me. Back to the topic at hand though. I was talking about my progress. I read some when I got home and I'm still reading, but I probably feel like I'm going to like end it for the night. I am ending, I'm looking over at my Kindle. Ending on page 159, that's the beginning of chapter 22. A weird part of me kind of wishes that like it didn't have like the completion number at the bottom, because sometimes I'll look at it and I'll be like, oh, only 20%. I'll blink again. Oh my god, like 40%. And I wish, I don't know, weird, but I wish there was a way to like kind of turn that off. Like I'm not in love with like tracking my progress in that way along like reading the book. Thoughts right now, I feel like the pop culture references have lessened as right now we're almost halfway into the book. I feel like I'll probably finish it within the next couple of days, which now I'm like, I'm probably not going to meet with my book club until the end of this month, which is like the beginning of the month right now. So I'm like, well, I've forgotten a lot of like niche plot points by then. Who knows? But the pop culture references have lessened, which is like nice because you guys know how I feel about that. I feel like the humor in this book is not like I'm not the biggest fan of it. It's kind of like not like it's kind of slapsticky in a way that doesn't particularly like work for me. I can tell that there's like an undercurrent of like tenderness and like anguish and angst that is like upcoming, and we've kind of already been like teased a bit like in this book that I'm like looking forward to exploring more, but we'll see. There's a couple of like grammatical choices that have been made in the book so far too that I'm not in love with, where it's like no, and then the book like writes out like the O's, or a lot of like exclamations with exclamation points, which may sound like silly, but it feels like it doesn't lead a lot up to the reader to just know that like if you just said like no, I would know that like, oh yeah, like the book can maybe be like it was drawn out in a way like, you know, as opposed to like no. It just feels like maybe this is trying to give like the dichotomy between like she's died, which is like the premise of the book. That's not really a spoiler. She's died and she's come back with like trying to keep like the loftier element of like some humor, but it just feels sometimes like weirdly out of place and just like it doesn't really make me laugh. I feel like where the book like in its quieter moments between like the main character and like other characters she meets, because she's kind of like she doesn't really notice it herself, you can tell, but she's kind of like awkward, standoffish, or she notices it and she's like intentional about it, but like she doesn't realize that like yeah, like, people like want to become friends with you because they want to become like friends with you. Maybe they like sharing like your presence and stuff. I feel like it's in moments like that, the kind of more like deadpan, which may be like just like a subjective personal preference, but that's where it kind of leans more into like my personal liking when it comes to things like that. But it's more so like certain choices I feel like the book is making where I'm like, oh, I would love it more if like it went in kind of like another direction. So that's kind of where I am. Also, I feel like I've read enough romance at this point to know like who the main love interest is going to be in this book or who already is. And I don't know. I can tell the kind of dynamic that has been like built up between them, kind of the way it's being framed. I feel like I have to reserve a bit of judgment because I haven't even reached like the halfway mark in that regard to say how I feel about that, but it's definitely an enemies to lovers case in that sense, where I'm like, you know, like it's convinced me enough, I suppose, but I'm still kind of on the fence just because, like, I think lately for a lot of contemporary enemies to lovers romances that I've read, there is this element of, I think in a book strive to make the banter feel very like bantery. It feels a little too like slapsticky at moments where I'm like, oh, this can be funny, but it doesn't have to feel like cartoonish, I guess. But again, that can just lean back on like that. Maybe it's just like not my style of humor, but it's so effusive in this book that it's kind of hard to ignore. I will say the things that I like so far, it's kind of like the quieter moments where it feels like it's more deadpan or it's more the character is spending a little bit more like time with herself. But I feel like now we're still on the journey of like which is the plot of the book. I don't feel like it's really like a spoiler. And maybe we have to like jump over that hurdle to get to like more of it. I've talked about this a little bit more too on my TikTok actually, if you're curious about this. The self-deprecation and self-criticizing of a lot of main characters recently. We'll talk about that later at the end of the book because that's like more of an overarching point. Yeah, those are my thoughts so far. Now that I'm like into the throes of this book, I'll probably like finish it tomorrow, if not like the next day, and then jump back into Kindred. Good night, ladies. Okay, so let's talk about Deep End and The Love of My Afterlife because I finished The Love of My Afterlife last night and I finished Deep End before I started this vlog, and so let's talk about both of them before I go on and finish Kindred. First, The Love of My Afterlife because it's the freshest in my mind. Main critique of this book is that I feel like it took too long to find its footing for me. This is not to say there weren't some bright spots. The main character Delphi's arc of not only like loving yourself but like not letting your life pass you by, and that like yeah, life can be hard and sad and make you like angry at times. The world is tough. That what makes it easier is even as an introvert, surrounding yourself with people, surrounding yourself with a community that cares about you, especially in your 20s, is like so necessary. And that's an arc that I feel like really gets fleshed out towards the end. So maybe that's why that was my favorite part of the book. But the moments leading up to that are filled with so much kind of like slapstick comedy humor that didn't really work for me. And I don't like to overuse the word like cringy as a critique because I feel like it's gotten overused as a critique. Like everything in romance books is like cringy all of a sudden. Like, no, I don't agree with that. But there were so many moments in this that were cringy for me. And I could kind of tell from the beginning of the book. I think I told you guys that I didn't think the humor was going to work for me. And all throughout, it kind of didn't. There were moments between Delphi, the main character, and who I'm not going to spoil, who is obviously going to end up being her love interest, kind of when the book like leaned into that more like deadpan humor, which is probably just a subjective thing. But when it felt like it wasn't trying too hard to be funny is when it was funny to me. And I understood the book was trying to keep its lightheartedness in dealing with a concept, a subject like death and the afterlife. And I think it did that, but I do think it could have done that without some of the moments just felt so. I think the humor in this is taking away from like not even like the gravity of a moment, but more so like, oh, I want to learn more about. Hey, somebody's car is going off. Give me a second. Okay, it stopped. But what I was trying to say is that sometimes I would want to lean into moments in the book. They weren't even like super serious or had like a lot of gravity to them, but more so that like I just felt like it didn't need sometimes all of the. I feel like there's really no other way to say it, but like kind of slapstick humor that came along with it. But even outside of that, The Love of My Afterlife and Deep End to an extent are not like causes of this problem, but I do think they're like leaning into this critique that I'm. One moment. Okay, guys, I was talking to my mom and I got sidetracked. Where were we? Okay, I just watched the last clip to get a better idea of what I was working with before I lost my track of mind. Characters who are super self-deprecating in this kind of like pithy, or it's supposed to come off as like quirky and relatable way, but once you start reading it across enough, I'm sure this is happening across like other genres because I have been confirmed and told from a TikTok video posted talking about this exact subject that it's happening across other genres, but in romance specifically, I've been noticing it across female main characters because I usually read romance books about female main characters, so that's why I'm talking about this niche and this genre. That relatability lately has been like disliking yourself. For both Deep End and The Love of My Afterlife, there is an element to the arc that's kind of both of them like coming into themselves, learning to like love themselves and like not be so hard on themselves to a certain extent. But there is also this element of just me kind of wondering society wise what it says that there's so much relatability in like not liking yourself. I think more so what I'm trying to get at is just raising the question of what it means that it's clear to me lately that like a hallmark of relatability, like with a book or a main character trying to connect with the reader, is like putting themselves down in this like self-deprecating way and it trying to come across as usually these like lighthearted or funny moments, but you read it enough time across books that you start to like sit back and realize like why is this the hallmark of relatability and like what does it say about the way that we view like confidence and like being assured in yourself in society. This is me not saying, of course, that all expressions of vulnerability are like books using them as a tool to like trick the reader and like connecting to the main character. More so because those expressions of vulnerability can be very like cathartic to read, to be honest. But it's more so just like in tandem with like Timothy Chalamet's like SAG Award speech, and like how people had a couple like critiques of that speech, but like one of the hallmarks that I kept seeing was that, my God, he's so like cringy and like, God, he's so like full of himself. And but I watched the speech personally, and I was like, nothing about this comes off as particularly like cocky or anything like that. It's just like he's assured of himself. And I think that's basically what I'm trying to get at too, is that I notice it because it's like, damn, does nobody like themselves anymore? Like I can pass by like a pithy remark or two, like putting yourself down, but once it becomes like a consistent framework for a character, it's like, what is that? Like, what does that say? It says something, and I may make a video essay about that because I want to speak more about it. Back to Love in My Afterlife. I realize I actually don't have that much more to say, except that I wish that the book had caught more of my interest sooner. I struggle, honestly, to know if I want to give this book like even a 3, because for me, a 3 for a book is like minimum, at least for me. That, of course, like I take book recommendations to other people like very seriously. Like I need to know what you like what kind of reader are you. But like 3 for me is bare minimum, that like I would recommend this to like somebody else. And because this book takes for me so long to like really get the story, not even to get the story like interesting, because it takes off like running from the first couple of pages in terms of like plot and storytelling, but it didn't really feel like until the second half of the book that I was like, oh, I'm really invested to see like where this is going. Up until then, it just kind of felt like a series of comedic like skit moments. And then the relationship between the main character and who was going to be her love interest, without spoiling, just felt very, the pacing was interesting. There's an enemies to lovers aspect to the relationship. I'm not really sure if the whole enemies bit really worked for me. At times it did, at times it didn't, but I feel like overarchingly I didn't really feel like I was sold on their chemistry, to be honest. I think they had a few sweet moments definitely at the end, but for most of them getting to know each other, and maybe because it's hard not to spoil as I'm talking about this, but maybe because them knowing each other kind of to an extent happens like off screen before the book, like we come into like learning about their relationship to an extent, but it just felt kind of thin. And I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, what is chemistry? How can you detect it? How can you know that you're like witnessing it or like you feel it? But like, I know when I feel it and I know when I don't. And you know, the book kind of recognizes itself that like towards the end, Delphi recognizes like, oh, I just like want to get to like know him more. Maybe that's the beginning of like every great relationship, like just wanting to get to know somebody more. But even in terms of like there was just something about their chemistry that wasn't really clicking for me for most of the book until the end. And that's the thing for me. Like I don't feel like a book can really just only start capturing my attention in the last like 60 pages. And I'm like, wow. And as I was just thinking about like, Diva, why don't you feel like you can give this book a 3-star? I was like, also because of the pop culture references. It was not only being used as a device for humor, but they were just in the beginning in particular, which is maybe why it was such a slow start for me. As in like, not the book was moving slow, but it was felt like, oh my God, I have to kind of like plow through this, was because of the unnecessary pop culture references. It was back to back to back reference. And then it honestly like it really slowed down throughout the rest of the book. So I was like, why was all of the beginning like that? It was probably to set the tone of like what the humor was going to be like in the book, but instead, as somebody who doesn't love them, it kind of like turned me away from that. And then this is something that I wish would stop happening in like contemporary romance books, is like the name dropping of other modern day romance authors in these books. I've seen it happen a couple times now, where more often than not, because Emily Henry is such a prolific like romance author now, or like Ali Hazelwood, they're name dropped like constantly in other romance books, and I'm like, when it plays into the specific reference is usually largely unnecessary. You could say, usually more often than not, it can just be like, I was reading this romance book, and that would be like a perfect substitute. But the book feeling like it needs to make sure you know exactly what author they're talking about usually does nothing for the scene or the plot. And like, as I told you guys before, that's where pop culture references start to bug me, when it just feels like it's being used for like this, the book trying to be like, I know about this thing, and it's like, okay, but like what does that do for like my experience as a reader? Also, when I was in the midst of enjoying that last pages of the book, there was a name dropping of like Lucy's score, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And I say this like for across other genres too. Like if I was reading like a contemporary like lit fic, for example, and I think it name dropped a bunch of modern day authors, like even outside of the romance genre, like back to back, I'd be like, my whole thing for pop culture references is like, what is the intent? What are you trying to get across with this pop culture reference? They don't always bother me, pop culture references, but when they're utilized like that, it's like, what are we doing here? It's just always going to take me out of my reading. So overall, I think I do like the messaging of this book. There are a lot of books lately in the romance genre that I feel talk about taking charge of your life and things like that, but I kind of like the specific aspect that this book took on of like not letting your life like pass you by. Like you have to go out and live your life. You can't just be like a side character in it. And I liked the ending, but I feel like there were too many aspects that made me sit back and think like, I wasn't really in love with that. Very cute usage of color in the cover though. Okay, so now let's talk about Deep End. Ali Hazelwood more often than not writes a female main character, I'm just gonna say an FMC, that is usually quirky. She's usually on the more like people-pleasing end, usually like kind of tiny in comparison to the huge male main character. And I'm one to say I am a size difference truther. I am. I do. I like it. Sorry. I feel like that's like one thing people really like hate about her work, but like that usually works for me. It didn't work for me in Love theoretically though, because here's the thing. Usually that's the kind of female main character that like Ali Hazelwood writes. She usually has some kind of like interest in like STEM or medicine, which I really do like. I also really liked it in Deep End. I enjoy the exploration of that. From the male main character standpoint, he's usually, like I said, huge. He's usually kind of quiet. Female main character usually for one reason or another thinks that he like hates her. He doesn't hate her. He's actually probably like desperately in love with her. He's yearning for her even. That is one thing also that I saw TikTok about recently, and they were like, people don't write yearning anymore. I don't think people write yearning anymore, but I think that's part of the reason why Ali Hazelwood's books like keep bringing me back to them too, is she knows how to write like a quiet like longing. It's obvious to us as the reader more often than not, but it's like a quiet longing sometimes. But that is, I think, sometimes what trips me up as well in her work is what I've started calling like overdone obliviousness from the female main character. I think there is only so obtuse you can make a character to the male main character's feelings until it starts feeling like is the intention to make her seem a bit like silly or stupid even, because it'll be like right in front of her face and she'll be like, I think he like hates me. I do like that that was tempered in Deep End, where the female main character is aware that she's like running away from like the emotional aspect of this relationship, that like she doesn't want to talk about it, she's like hiding herself. And so it didn't feel so much as like, Scarlett, like come on, like obviously he's like desperately in love with you, so much as like she recognizes at a certain point that he's in this like deep with her and she's the one like running away from it. Do I think this book is gonna like sit with me? No, not particularly, which is why I don't really know where to rank this amongst my Ali Hazelwood books. I enjoyed it. I do feel like the new adult age range is still finding its footing in the romance genre. And I do feel like when it comes to, this isn't much something I thought about really until just now, that I do think that Ali Hazelwood captured the voice of like college students. I would say Scarlett at least pretty well. Do I think that there's any man out there like Lucas who's like in his like early 20s? No, not really. But at least for Scarlett, it felt like they were college students. A big problem that I have with the new adult age range more often than not is it feels like the characters, kind of like Lucas, are much too mature to be like college students, or they sound juvenile like high schoolers. But I feel like Scarlett was like a pretty even middle ground. Like I could believe that she was in college and she was at this time in her life when she was making a lot of different decisions and she was kind of unsure of herself, especially like post her injury. So I feel like I'm getting a little bit away from myself, which I feel like I often do during reviews. To get back to the point I was talking about earlier, which is why I mentioned the dynamic that I can tell like Ali Hazelwood favors, is because the books can start to feel copy paste at a certain point. It's why I realized that I don't think I can read her books like two back to back, because as much as I do like that dynamic, and I feel like a lot of people like that dynamic, you read too much of like anything over again and it feels like it's becoming like a bit stale. The character dynamic in The Love Hypothesis is that in Love Theoretically, which is that in Deep End, which is kind of, but not really that so much in Bride, which is probably also why maybe it being a divergence is why I like enjoyed it so much for its like differences. And so that's why I talked about character dynamics in the beginning, because while I don't believe that every author has to reinvent the wheel of like romance, Ali Hazelwood has found her niche and she is good at it. I think this is the same thing I discovered like with one of my favorite YA authors like Emma Mills. I can't read her books two back to back, even though I enjoy them for the most part when I'm reading them, because it is the same element of like a girl who believes like her worst flaw is like being ordinary. There's a found family element. There's like a quirky plot somewhere. I really love it, but it becomes a bit too, oh, this book is like this book, that is like this book, that is like this book that you've written. And I feel like the same case with like Ali Hazelwood, where I walked away from this enjoying this, but I think that's why it's like not particularly gonna sit with me. I liked the way that the story unfolded. I feel like when this book first came out, there was a lot of uproar about a couple of things, like this book not being kinky enough or this book like being too kinky. Now having finished it, I think them being college students, exploring themselves like sexually between like one another and like trusting one another and like having that element of like communication, I think the way that they engage intimately in the book like made complete sense to me. Also in particular, like the, oh my god, I didn't realize this book would have like so much sex in it. There's literally a foreword in the book that says like Ali Hazelwood is exploring like her lengths like as an author with this book. So like I didn't really understand like that conversation at all. I like the diving and sports element. That just felt like fresh. I don't think I've taken a step back from like sports romances. I feel like I was like a really big lover of them, and then I just got so overwhelmed with like the flood of them that feels like it's been happening post maybe like 2021, 22. But I think I haven't read like a swimming romance, and so that was fun. To the negatives, I've talked about the character dynamic. I think that's also why like the male love interest in this book isn't gonna particularly sit with me either. I like the character dynamic that Ali Hazelwood has between her characters, even if it feels copy paste at a certain point. But I think something I've also realized about myself as a reader recently is that I do want male love interests that are a bit more not so perfect. Mind you, that is one of the things in the book they acknowledge, that like Lucas, he's the male love interest, that like he's not as perfect as like Scarlett thinks he is. Like he has his own flaws himself. But that is usually the thing about male main characters like him. Like they have one fatal flaw. Like, otherwise, they kind of present like perfectly. There were like a couple hiccups in the book in regards to like I guess his behavior, but for the most part they're like flawless. And I've realized like for myself as a reader, I like male love interests that are just like a little bit more messy. Mind you, I completely understand we get enough shitty men in real life, so we don't need that encapsulated in books. And I think like Ali Hazelwood understands that, and so I do appreciate like coming to her books for a breath of fresh air when I need a reminder like, yes, like romance. But I think that's why he's just really not going to sit with me as the most compelling character. In a world that is pushing the dual POV first person storytelling aspect of romances, I so appreciate it that this book is told completely in Scarlett's point of view, and then we get a last chapter that is told in Lucas's from a third point of view. I love when books are told like that. Bride was also told like that with more snippets of like the male main character's like point of view, but that is my bread and cheese. I love that. And now I realize I had other bigger critiques. I was like, Diva, something was stopping you from giving this book like a 4. Like what was it? And I feel like I need to spoil to talk about those things, and so like now I say spoiler, like please jump ahead where I will be like reading Kindred. If you do not want to be spoiled, I will see you soon. But now for like 2 quick points. One, sometimes things will happen in books where I'm like, oh, this only happened because I don't know how to explain it. This is gonna sound kind of silly, but like, oh, we only had this happen because we needed like the plot to move forward. Once you start learning about a character or a situation, it doesn't really make sense in like the grand scheme of things. Not like really like a Deus Ex Machina, but kind of. Part of the book, really the inciting whole incident from this book is that Penelope, who's Lucas's, becomes his ex-girlfriend. Penelope and Lucas are dating at like the beginning of the book. Penelope reveals that Lucas is into BDSM and being in charge in the bedroom sexually, and she's not into that. They break up for a couple other reasons, but like that's namely one of them. She reveals this to like Scarlett and I think like the rest of the diving team, and Scarlett comes to Penelope after that to share that like Scarlett herself is interested in like BDSM. Once you get to know Scarlett's character like more in the book, this just like didn't really make sense to me, to be so for real. And this happens kind of at the beginning of the book, and so you have like another like I think 300 pages to get to know Scarlett better. And once you get to know Scarlett better, this conversation that she has with Penelope, because she comes to Penelope and shares this like willingly, I remember thinking like, wow, that's a very like honest and like brave, especially like being like, I think Scarlett is like 21 in the book. And then we get to know Scarlett for like the rest of the book, and I remember just thinking to myself, in the grand scheme of things, I just couldn't really imagine that like Scarlett would have been the one moving to have like that conversation with Penelope. It's a conversation that needed to happen so like the next thing can happen that I'm gonna like share, but it just didn't really fit with like Scarlett's character once I really just started thinking about it more. And so because Scarlett has that conversation with Penelope, when she's drunk reveals this to like Lucas, alerts him that Scarlett is into BDSM as well. To now talk about Penelope as a character, because I feel like she is like one of the reasons why people said that they really did not like this book, could not stand her character, could not stand her. I mean, the book acknowledges it seems like Penelope's character, she's a little meddling. Scarlett like mentions in the book that Penelope kind of has like a big personality and it gravitates and like pulls people towards her, but she also thinks that sometimes she can like play with people and their feelings like toys, because she pushes Scarlett and Lucas together, but it's like, I really particularly didn't have a problem with this or like Penelope's character in particular to be so for real. I actually really appreciated that like the villain in this book, as opposed to like some of Ali Hazelwood's like previous books, which was one of my critiques of love theoretically, is it's not this like obvious big bad villain with like evil intentions, which can be fun sometimes, but sometimes it can just feel a little like caricaturish. Penelope was, you know, also a girl who she let her complicated feelings about their relationship cloud her judgment in certain moments and get the best of her. Not to absolve her of responsibility, but I appreciated that she wasn't just this like stock villain character mean girl, and she was like a fully fledged person, it felt like. What I really wasn't in love with was her and Scarlett's friendship in particular. I keep thinking back to like my own college days and how circumstantial some friendships could be, very much like you see each other at class every day, you see each other at like lunch every day. Okay, moving spaces quickly because I usually have my light over there, but I could not find it, and so which is getting way too dark. I just feel like for the depth of the gravity that they were giving to their friendship by the end, I just wasn't necessarily feeling that friendship building along the way as it was happening. And as I was saying before, because like I understand because friendships can happen like so quickly when you're in college and like when you're younger, there's a part of me that's still trying to understand that element of it, to understand like why they became friends what felt like so quickly, even though I knew they knew each other before the book started like off page. But there was something about it that just felt very like, you guys are already like best, like they started kind of like equating each other to being like best friends. And I also understand in regards to like Scarlett's character, she talks about like not really having like any particularly like close friends, and so that relationship with Penelope being so special to her. But I think that's more so just like what I couldn't get behind. That's more of like a general pet peeve I have across like a book trying to tell me that like these characters are friends, but me being like, are they really? Like by the middle of the book, I did definitely feel like Scarlett and Penelope were close, but there's kind of these moments where they talk about, Scarlett will be like, oh, Penelope and I went to like a concert, we went to like this and that, which I feel like was supposed to also fill in that time of like these are these moments where they were getting closer. But I think the book is also already pushing like almost 350 like above pages. We couldn't get like more screen time of them together, but I think by the end where it feels like they're really each other's person, that would have made more sense to me, if that makes sense. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I feel like right now I have it at like a 3.25 slash like 3.5. I think right now it goes Bride, Deep End, Love Theoretically, and like The Love Hypothesis on the same. Mind you, I don't think any of these books are like terrible, but I think like that's how it goes for me currently. Those are my reviews of both of those. I'm going to finish Kindred because I am traveling tomorrow for work. I'm not going to be bringing physical copies of books. That like never works out for me. I'm going to finish it tonight so I can talk to you guys about it tomorrow. Bye, cuties. Okay, let's talk about Kindred. I finished this book in 2 sittings. That's how you know it was gripping me. The first half being when you guys saw me like reading in the car, and then I finished it last night, which one I now realize about myself as like if I am going to reread books, I think it needs to be far apart enough like this. Like when I read this book, it was in high school. That was like years ago. And I feel like I was able to really experience it again for the first time, like reading it now as an adult. This book was harrowing. I feel like that's the best way to put it. Octavia Butler's writing is strong, and I feel like that's what keeps okay. Like I was saying, Octavia Butler's writing is strong. The prose, the voice of the character. I feel like Dana, the main character in the book, asked questions, made choices. She was fearful, she was curious, and also honestly she reacted quote unquote like better in that situation. Okay, I changed the positioning of the camera because I'm in front of the window and the glare and the cutting of the blinds is all over my face. I feel like it was distracting. Getting back to the book, mind you, of course when like unbelievable situations are happening to main characters, I don't expect them to be on the ball perfect. I mean, she's traveling back in time to Antebellum, Maryland, and she's being treated as a slave after living as a modern day woman in 1976. She reacted better, honestly, than I would in the situations that she was placed in. More so, I've been thinking about the quote that was in the book since I saw it, because it was raised a couple of times, but it was so poignant of like, it's much easier and more horrific than anybody would imagine to turn somebody into a slave. That's something Dana grapples with towards the end of the book, and how a lot of the other field slaves see her. Another character says how quickly you become accommodating and submissive as a slave, when at the beginning of the book Dana was like, this is never going to like break me down. I also know that Octavia Butler is a very prolific science fiction writer. Do I feel like this necessarily leaned as much into the science fiction of it all as I feel like it could have, as I feel Octavia Butler is probably capable of? No, and so I am left to a degree wondering we could have gotten more questions answered, but it's in that rock and a hard place of I feel like this book will stick with me a little bit longer because we didn't really have some of those questions answered. Also, the time travel element of it all isn't as important to the story as what's happening, if that makes sense. Yes, I wanted to know why Dana was time traveling in the first place, and do I think having answers to that question would have been nice? Yes, but I feel like it was very clear as I went on reading that that wasn't the intention of this book. It was more so to really illustrate how when history feels so far removed from you in regards to slavery, it feels just like that, like history. But slavery existed and happened for 400 brutal long years, and this book perfectly highlights that we're just not as far removed from the past as we would like to think, and also how many long-lasting effects from slavery still exist in modern day America. To speak back to the science fiction of it all, this is the only book I've read of Octavia Butler's work. I've now read it twice. I would like to read more of her work that kind of lean more into the science fiction of it all, because this definitely did feel more like historical fiction. I kind of, at a certain point, just accepted the time traveling as a part of it's going to happen, whereas I feel like maybe in another book I would have been like, why is she time traveling? Like, what's going on? To also not spoil, but to get my thoughts across, I also think there was a lot of smart characterization in this book in terms of each time we were introduced to a character, what they represented, what they were either going to teach us or how their characterization was going to illustrate something in the story to Dana. Do I think this book could have been longer? Yes, but I also think that it ended exactly where it needed to a degree. I think it caps off right just about under 300 pages. There were some plot lines in regards to Dana's husband, in regard to the time travel, in regard to the length of time that passes in between in the past when Dana is time traveling. But I'm going to be honest, there's sometimes I read books and I'm left with more questions and I'm like, the amount of questions I'm left with does impact my reading of the book because I feel like the book was like trying to dodge like answering those, but it more so felt like, yes, the science fiction of it all with time traveling, but this book did feel more like historical fiction to me and more an exploration of the horrors of slavery. I would say in thinking about this star rating, I would land this book at around, I would say like a 4.5. Like this book made me go back to the beginning of it and like reread the prologue because the prologue starts off with the ending and then you follow Dana throughout like her navigations, her travels until you realize how you got to that ending that's at the beginning of the book. But honestly, because there had been so many harrowing, so many daunting, so many how is she going to get herself out of the situation things that happened throughout the book, I kind of forgot that something even so horrific happens at the beginning, which I feel like speaks to Octavia Butler's storytelling. There was present and also unspoken danger around every corner, which speaks to the mindset of being a slave, which I feel like the book really encapsulated perfectly. I will say, understanding in general, like why this terrible situation was happening to Dana would have been nice to know. It's the circumstance of like happenstance of being the main character, but she's left in such a harrowing position by the end. I feel like I keep saying that, like harrowing, daunting, like haunting, but those are kind of the perfect words that left me from this book. But she's left in such a situation that at the end, it would have to a degree been nice to have like I guess a little bit of closure of why this had even been happening to her in the first place. But I guess maybe that's also what the book is supposed to leave you with, an unsettled feeling. So I feel like right around within the 4 range, like where this book would leave me. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me react, read, and do what I love. So see you guys next time.